What is a civilization? Well, a civilization is the shared history, the shared conscience, and the shared land of a people. It is the stories that they tell their children. It's the books that they revere. It's the historical figures and archetypes and myths that they revere. It's the heroes that they remember. It's the graves that they tend to. It's the national holidays and the symbolism behind what those national holidays commemorate. That is a civilization. And right now, all of that is disappearing before our very eyes. Not in some distant future, right now, before our very eyes. This video is going to make some people uncomfortable. Good, because if you're unwilling to make people uncomfortable, you can't really speak your mind, because the moment you stand up for something, you cast a shadow, and that shadow has an antithetical element, which will inevitably attract opposition and detractors. But with that being said, let's get right into the core of this video, which is I believe that Western civilization is dying. And I believe that this is going to have profound negative consequences for the world. And this is something that really needs to be talked about and really needs to be prevented, which we'll get to towards the end of the video. But the first thing I want to discuss is the death of cultural memory. The first pillar of any civilization is cultural conscience, the literature, the art, the stories that bind people together across generations. How many French youngsters do you know? I speak French, right? I'm Canadian. How many French youngsters do you know, if you were to travel to France, that have read Alexandre Dumas? How many French youngsters do you know that could even tell you why the French Revolution happened, that could even tell you about the Napoleonic Wars? These are such significant events in French history, yet how many French youngsters do you know that talk about them? And the answer is not very many. How many English youngsters do you know that read John Milton, that read Shakespeare? How many American youngsters you know? America's the worst one out of all of them, right? If you look at the state of the youth in America, that's a different topic altogether. But how many American youngsters do you know that have read Hawthorne, that have read Mark Twain, John Steinbeck, F. Scott Fitzgerald, H.P. Lovecraft, right? These American classics. And the answer is not very many. What happened to reading? And reading is not just about the physical act of reading books, because you can go and read some random newsletter. Technically, you're engaging in the act of reading. But when you look at these stories that were, these books, these novels that were popular for generations, for centuries in some cases, the stories that they talk about, whether it's American literature, often referencing the Puritan culture of the founders and how, rebelling against that Puritan culture often made someone ostracized by society, whether it's a lot of Russian literature is about despair and sorrow and overcoming life's hardships and winning in the end, right? It's what the literature represents. And not many teenagers and kids read the literature of their respective countries in the West. Now, it's not because these books are unavailable. If anything, thanks to Amazon, thanks to bookstores, thanks to public transportation, and the fact that most people have access to some form of transportation like cars, scooters, motorcycles, they're free. You can find them online in minutes, right? You can go and buy them off Amazon for $20 or 20 euros. The problem is something else entirely, the complete collapse of the attention span, right? Because of the instant gratification culture we live in. And it's also because many of them don't feel the need to understand and digest this literature and the history of their culture. It's like, let's say you have a society, and in that society, you have certain rules and regulations that were brought about through violence and through, a lot of suffering and a lot of hardship. Let's say an entire community, through a lot of violence, established certain rules, right? Thou shalt not kill, thou shalt not steal. If you do steal, you're getting your hand chopped off or head chopped off, right? They establish a very peaceful society over generations. The next few generations grow up without realizing the society that existed before, without realizing just how evil, grotesque, and brutal things can actually be, without institutions in place to prevent that, without, mechanisms of enforcement like law enforcement out there to prevent that. And they become very soft and complacent, right? And because they become very soft and complacent, they forget why these institutions exist. Give it a couple of more generations, and people don't even realize. People start questioning, what's the point of these institutions? What's the point of law enforcement? What's the point of having all these, different things in place? And it comes down to that quote: hard times create strong men create good times create weak men create hard times. And that perfectly encapsulates what we're seeing in the West today. We've traded Steinbeck for short-term video. We've traded Milton for memes. And the result is you have an entire generation that doesn't know where they came from. And a civilization can't survive without that knowledge. If you have nothing to pass down to your children, you have nothing to pass down to your grandchildren in terms of that knowledge, it's not going to survive. Perhaps you could say it would survive because of the internet, but if people don't even know what to seek out, if no one remembers the name of certain authors and they don't even know what to type into Google in the first place, do you really think they're going to randomly come across it because over the busyness of their lives, like they're just going to randomly come across it? Probably not. Take Canada, for instance, right? Just as we have, people not reading literature and not reviling revering their national heroes anymore, you also have the death of a reveration of history. People don't look at their history with passion and with vigor and with pride anymore. Take Canada, for instance. You have, John A. Macdonald, you have Confederation, you have the founding of a nation, you have Sir Wilfrid Laurier, one of Canada's greatest prime ministers, who expanded westward, who added the provinces of Alberta, Saskatchewan. You have, so much Canadian history that we could teach in schools, but instead we don't do that, right? You have, how many Canadian kids can name even 10 of our prime ministers? How many of them could tell you the story of Lester Pearson, how he won a Nobel Peace Prize for, for acting as a peacekeeper during the Suez Crisis? How many of them even know what the Suez Crisis was in the 1950s? How many of them know how the Canadian healthcare system came, about with Tommy Douglas and the prairie tradition of fighting for working peoples? Now, these are extraordinary men, right? I'm talking about Canada in specific, but every country has their version of extraordinary men that that the coming generation should revere. And these people are not revered anymore. In fact, a lot of them are detested, and a lot of them are analyzed through this hypercritical perspective using modern morality. Modern morality is a symptom of modernity, and you can't take that symptom of modernity and analyze historical figures with it. That is preposterous, right? If you look at someone that made great achievements, for instance, the British Empire fought to outlaw slavery in the 1800s. The Royal Navy literally patrolled the waves and prevented the slave trade from taking place when it was Africans on the coast of Africa enslaving other Africans and selling them off. The British Navy did so many great things when it came to eradicating slavery in the modern world. Yet, are we taught that in school? We're not, right? Instead, you're taught about the British Empire through this hypercritical perspective that just makes you want to hate your own history instead, which is something I'll get to momentarily as well. The second big problem is the birth rate crisis. The birth rate crisis is like no country in the West has a population and a birth rate that, if present trends continue, is going to be able to sustain itself towards the end of the century. The replacement rate, meaning the number of children that women need to have in order for a country to continue existing, is 2.1. And every country in the West is below the replacement rate. France, Germany, the UK, the United States, Canada, none of them are hitting the number, and most of them are well below it. And I believe the number is 1.1 or 1.2, but no civilization on Earth has reversed a 1.1 or 1.2 birth rate, which is absolutely insane to think about. So what's causing this? What's causing the low birth rate? Well, the delay of family formation. Young people are being told by culture, by media, by university that career comes first and parenthood can wait. If we've seen anything in post-2020, post-COVID, it's that your career can be gone like that, whereas children are forever, right? Your job will lay you off in like 2 seconds and not care about you and tell you that your services aren't needed anymore, and then you're left stranded. Whereas your children will be there for life, hopefully, right? Or the chances of them being there are far greater. Very few people who major in what they study in college actually end up using that degree for what the job requires, right? A lot of it is just learning on the job. A lot of jobs as well are going to, with the advent of AI, with the advent of automation, are going to be not necessary in the coming decades. So I don't think it makes sense. People don't have careers anymore like they used to. If you were born in the 1940s, 50s, 60s, you had a career. Like you were a journalist, and you were a journalist for like 50 years. Right now, with the advent of social media, with the advent, like journalism's changing very, very fast, right? Most people are taking their advice from independent sources that they trust rather than mainstream media, which I think is a good thing. But like every industry is changing. So it doesn't make sense in my view to prioritize career before, family formation, but that's what youngsters are told. Then another problem is biology. Biology doesn't negotiate. The longer people wait to have children, the fewer children they're going to have. The second reason the birth rate's collapsing is the cost of living crisis. Housing is unaffordable, childcare is unaffordable, inflation is eroding people's ability to live. Another reason is the collapse of religiosity. Religious communities tend to have more children. In the West, we've forgotten about religion. You have some countries in Europe, I believe the Czech Republic, Slovakia, even places like Germany and France, where I believe atheism and agnosticism is the biggest religion over Christianity, which is absolutely insane, right? This one is controversial, but it matters. Like, religious communities have always had high birth rates, and religious communities are more likely to have children of their own. And if you have human beings have religions of some sort. I think every human has a religion, even if it's not Christianity. It's going to be woke ideology. It's going to be the culture in which they live in. They're going to adapt something, as something is going to fill that void that exists because of religion. And unfortunately, the things that are filling these voids don't encourage people to have kids. Another one is the erosion of community, which is another reason why Western civilization is dying. People used to live in intergenerational housing. People used to live in short communities where they're within a short drive or a short walk of immediate family. That doesn't exist anymore. We're lonelier than any generation in recorded history. Surveys consistently show that people have fewer close friends, fewer deep relationships, less connection to their neighborhood and communities. And when you feel connected to your neighborhood and community, you're more likely to have more kids. Radical feminism. Now, there's nothing wrong with women working or pursuing careers or anything of that sort, but radical feminism in specific has put off a lot of women when it comes to having kids, right? It declares that the domestic sphere of life is somehow oppressive, and that the only way to be free as and independent and liberated as a woman is to work a career. And as I discussed previously, I don't think that's the case, but radical feminism is another reason. So the birth rate crisis, as well as people forgetting their history, are two reasons why Western civilization is dying. The third reason is the wars that broke the West. To understand where we are, you have to understand the First and Second World War. World War I and World War II were really the nail in the coffin of Western civilization. They were not just military conflicts, they were spiritual conflicts. They really damaged the spirit of the European continent. You look at World War I, right? Before World War I, you had the Napoleonic Wars, which were 100 years ago. And intermittently, between 1815, which is when Napoleonic War sort of ended-ish, and between 1914, the start of World War I, you had very few conflicts in Europe. You had a lot of conflicts where European empires were expanding. You had the Franco-Prussian War of 1870, but you didn't have that many wars on the continent itself. So 100 years of military technology and military advancements, people had no idea the scale of war that was going to take place. When World War I happened, French military were marching around the countryside in their horses because they thought it was just going to be like the Napoleonic Wars. It was going to be a traditional war that was over relatively soon. And meanwhile, German artillery shells were blowing them to pieces because of the technological advancement that took place. So this had a negative damage on the conscience of a people. Not just the conscience of a people, this had profound spiritual damage where people began to realize just how terrible war is, right? Then you have the fact that after the First World War, Germany was humiliated by the Treaty of Versailles. And consider the fact that Germany was about to win World War I. The Treaty of Brest-Litovsk in the East essentially meant that Germany won the Eastern Front. Germany won the Eastern Front, and in 1917, Russia or the Soviet Union ceded a lot of territory to Germany, and they ceded a lot of territory like Belarus, Poland, Ukraine. New countries, Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia, were created from the old territory of the Russian Empire as the Russian Revolution happened. So Germany won the Eastern Front, and they were winning the Western Front until the United States intervened. Now, why did the United States intervene? You could say that it's because of banking interests, or that's a different video altogether, where some people argue that the United States was deliberately misled into World War I. But after the United States intervened, Germany lost, and Germany was expected to pay huge reparations. Germany were expected to take full blame, and this was humiliating. How Germany went from being almost winning the war to now not only were they losing, and it wasn't a fair loss either, they had to unconditionally surrender. The Ruhr was occupied, which is this industrial heartland in southwestern Germany. The reparations were insane. And then you had World War II, and obviously this just set the stage for World War II, which was an even greater conflict. Oswald Spengler saw this as well. He wrote The Death of the West after the First World War, and I gave you a bunch of context on how the First World War really damaged the cultural conscience of the people. Oswald Spengler after the First World War, observed a decay in society, and he wrote his book, The Death of the West. And, you know, sitting in Munich after the war, watching Europe bleed, he understood that something had been broken, that the West had lost faith in itself, that the confidence, the vitality, the sense of purpose that built Western civilization, it had taken a wound that it might never recover from. And, you look at two world wars, tens of millions of dollars of debt, tens of millions dead, right? The flower of an entire generation wiped out in the trenches. The spiritual cost of this can't be overstated. Like, it really can't be overstated. So were, you know, the wars were really the nail in the coffin that killed Western civilization. And perhaps we're seeing the symptoms of that, 80 years on. And out of the wreckage came new ideologies that promised to explain the suffering, to assign blame, to tear everything down and start again. And one of these ideologies is cultural Marxism and the war on meaning. Cultural Marxism emerges from the Frankfurt School. Yeah. The Frankfurt School, which was popular after World War One. And as I gave you all that history, like, a lot of the ideologies that came out of the Frankfurt School, the culturally Marxist ideologies, came about to explain the suffering and the horrors of World War One. And a lot of, take for instance, like feminism and what feminism did to women. Instead of women being, very happy to continue to engage in the domestic sphere of life, you have the rise of disagreeable boss babes, radical feminists, like people like Simone de Beauvoir, who said that, I was watching an interview with some radical feminists, one of them whose name is Simone de Beauvoir, and she was asked, this is like 50 years ago, she was asked, oh, should women have a choice between whether or not they get to stay at home or whether or not they get to go to work? And she's like, no, they shouldn't have a choice, because most women would choose to stay at home. We need to force women to be liberated. We need to force women to go out into the workplace. You have abortion and the normalization of abortion at scale. 50 million dead in the US since 1970, 11 million babies aborted in Britain, 30 million plus in Russia, tens of millions across Europe, places like France, Spain, Ireland. Like, it's insane, right? The weaponization of history. Every civilization has sins. I don't deny that, right? Every civilization has sins. Every group of people have done things that they should be ashamed of. That is a universal constant across human nature. But no group has given more to humanity than Western civilization. No group has done more to benefit humanity than Western civilization. And yet, for some reason, in the West, the history has been weaponized. You're taught to hate great historical figures. You're taught to revile historical figures. You're taught to revile certain aspects of your history. It's insane. When you teach children that their history is nothing but impression, do you really think they're going to be filled with a strong sense of meaning and purpose to continue that civilization? Of course they're not going to be filled with a strong sense of meaning and purpose to continue that civilization. If you teach them that their ancestors only deserve contempt, then of course they're not going to have anything to be proud of. They're not going to want to learn the literature, the history, take part in that shared cultural conscience so they can continue their civilization. And now part 5 is mass migrations. We're all children of God, but God in the Bible mandates that we have nations. And if you change the people of a country, you change the society. You change the country itself, because countries are nothing more than people who live within them. It impacts social cohesion. It impacts all the different things we talked about. Different people have different traditions and different social and different cultural consciousness and different things that they value, right? Some people really value democracy and individual liberty. Other cultures really value collectivism. And when you have all these groups intermingling and mass migrating to the West, on top of the fact that cultural Marxism is eroding civilization, on top of the fact that kids are being taught to revile historical figures, on top of the fact that the spiritual deficit that exists in the West today because of World War I and because of World War II, but also because of things like radical feminism, things like cultural Marxism, things like the mass normalization of abortion and euthanasia and assisted suicide. And it really does feel as though the West is killing itself. It really does feel that way. So is Western civilization dying? Spengler thought so after World War I. Buchanan thinks so. Pat Buchanan's book, The Death of the West, is a book in and of itself that I can make another video on, but it was an inspiration to this video. But looking at the data, the birth rates, the cultural amnesia, the civilizational self-doubt, the normalization of abortion at scale, like to the tune of tens, hundreds of millions for no particular reason other than just not to have it, euthanasia, where the government's literally giving people the right, like not the right, or literally killing its own citizens. It's hard to argue that when what Spengler and Pat Buchanan argue is entirely wrong. In fact, you usually have to agree with them. But I don't think it's over. Civilizations have recovered before. They have found their footing. They have remembered who they were. They have chosen consciously to pass on something to the next generation. The choice is still available, but it requires courage. And courage is an emotion that is courage as a concept, as an emotion, you know, as a as a feeling is so lacking in the spiritual deficit that exists in the West today that courage is what's going to be required to recover and ail all of the ills that have plagued Western society for the past few decades. So is Western civilization dying? It's definitely on the path to committing suicide. Not many people are aware of the history that led us here. Not many people are aware of all that is going to all not many people are aware of all that will change in the world if the West continues to exist as the West. And that is a terrible thing. And that's something that should be combated. And hopefully we can recover it. But that is the essence of this video. I believe Western civilization is committing suicide. And it's very sad to see. It's very sad to see.